Hi folks, and welcome to the second part of our unit on gender and spectatorship. This time we're going to be looking at the second part of the male gaze, according to Laura Mulvey, which has to do with identification, rather than looking at women as objects. One question that I would ask based on what are the two components of the male gaze, according to Laura Mulvey? Why I think that question is important is because the male gaze is a term that has gotten popularized, but many people have forgotten about one of the core components of the male gaze. People often just assume that the male gaze is a synonym with men objectifying women as erotic displays. But for Mulvey, there are two components. The first is looking at women as objects, but the second is identifying with a male protagonist. And both are crucial to what Mulvey calls the male gaze in her essay. So Mulvey says the split between spectacle and narrative supports the man's role as the active one of forwarding the story, making things happen. The man controls the film fantasy and also emerges as a representative of power in a further sense, as the bearer of the look of the spectator. This is made possible by structuring the film around a main controlling figure, often a man with whom the spectator can identify. So it is crucial, right, that is, we have a story that is organized around a male perspective. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the whole system of narration she looks at. And she also theorizes this. She connects this identification with a male figure on screen with Jacques Lacan's notion of the mirror stage, which was a very popular theory just about how people come to identify themselves as subjects in the world. A subject is a kind of academic philosophical term for a person with a sense of self-awareness and agency. So what is the mirror stage? It's, according to psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, who was a devotee of Sigmund Freud, it's when a child recognizes themselves as an image in the mirror. The infant identifies with the image in the mirror and recognizes that the mirror image is almost superior to them, right? It's the idea of having a complete sense of yourself as being almost false, right? Because the mirror image is not equivalent to who we are. It is a picture. It is, in some sense, an abstraction that resembles us, but it still is not the same thing as us. Mulvey connects this to looking at the screen. Obviously, this is a kind of metaphorical connection, but Mulvey says there's an analogy between classical Hollywood spectators looking up and seeing a often white male heterosexual protagonist, and then identifying with that person, and then identifying with their hopes and dreams and desires and pursuits of particular goals. And this is exactly what we get in Vertigo, right? Notice, just anytime you watch a film, ask from whose perspective is it? Is it given, right? The film starts with Jimmy Stewart and it ends with Jimmy Stewart. It starts with Jimmy Stewart having a problem. That is, how is he going to overcome this newly absorbed fear of heights and corresponding difficulty or corresponding illness, vertigo? And also, is he going to fulfill his curiosity for Madeline? At the end of the film, he is the one who remains standing, even if his desires are not completely fulfilled. It is his storytelling. So we can say that, yes, the film has this formal element of POV, right? It has a lot of POV shots, but it's not just that. Narrative POV, or rather the idea of every story, every film story being from the point of view of a particular character, is equally, if not more so, important to Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze. She says, in Vertigo, subjective camera predominates. Apart from one flashback from Judy's point of view, the narrative is woven around what Scotty sees or fails to see. So it's not just the fact that it's subjective camera, it's also that what we see tends to be aligned toward Scotty's point of view. So we could say the same thing of Rear Window, the film that we started the class with, right? And Mulvey also does an analysis of Rear Window alongside Vertigo. She says the narrative revolves around Jeff, his fears of marriage, and his dissatisfaction with Lisa, and the narrative resolves those fears and dissatisfactions, right? We start with Jeff. He has a problem, just like he does in Vertigo. And it's also kind of a bodily kind of harm to him, right? He's been injured and he feels impotent, just like Scotty does. And the character arc is revolves around his trying to reclaim some kind of masculine agency, and he does. And we feel as if that is in some sense satisfied. And just like that, just like Vertigo, there are subjective POV shots in this film, but that does not necessitate, that is not sufficient criteria for male point of view. It's also the fact that the story revolves around Jeff's desires and goals. What about deeper questions about gaze and story structure? We talked about the importance for Mulvey that classical Hollywood film revolves around a male point of view. What about story structures that are a little more complicated, right? So I might kind of summarize Mulvey by saying, as I established, when women appear on screen, they often halt the diegesis, and we are encouraged to possess them with our gaze. However, their appearance is simultaneously threatening because they signify castration. So what do we do with that from a character, from a narrative design point of view? Well, there are two ways. Just as there are two parts of the male gaze, there are two kinds of stories that solve this problem that woman signifies a threat to men. So how do the men in these stories overcome the threat that women pose to them by signifying their own emasculation or castration? Well, the first Mulvey calls sadistic voyeurism, which is kind of like a punishment of the woman. Vertigo is very clearly a film that punishes Madeline/Judy. That should be obvious. How it punishes her is where it gets interesting for Mulvey, but just note how the film ends, right? But there's this other thing. Mulvey thinks that a film does not have to punish the woman to still fulfill the male gaze. It can actually do the opposite of punishing, which is to say overvalue a woman in such a way that she no longer becomes represented as human. Now, she talks about the films of Joseph von Sternberg as an example of this, to say that the way the camera fragments the body of Marlene Dietrich into these idealized parts makes her less of a human, less whole, and kind of values her as a kind of goddess. Well, we can think about Rear Window as doing something similar. Though this isn't quite Mulvey's argument. I think we can, because we've seen Rear Window, we haven't seen a von Sternberg film. Just think about Grace Kelly in this film Rear Window. There's a kind of fetishistic scopophilia. Scopophilia meaning the love of looking, and fetish meaning a kind of overvaluation of something as a substitute for kind of conventional sexual valuation. So consider Rear Window. And I'm quoting Mulvey. Lisa's exhibitionism has already been established by her obsessive interest in dress and style. In other words, she is a character who exhibits herself to us, the spectators, and to her boyfriend, in being a passive image of visual perfection. She's always really dressed really nice, and that's kind of the central aspect of her character. She's in the fashion industry. Jeffrey's voyeurism and activity have also been established through his work as a photojournalist. So their character roles are perfectly designed to create this relationship of looker and looked. And this is where I think Mulvey's analysis gets super smart and interesting with respect to Rear Window. Think about this for a moment. We watched the film. Jeff's girlfriend, Lisa, had been of little sexual interest to him, more or less a drag, so long as she remained on the spectator side. When she crosses the barrier between his room and the block opposite, the relationship is reborn erotically. Now we remember this moment, right? Because we remember this incredibly suggestive close-up of Jeff when he sees Grace Kelly return from the excursion, return from the adventure crossing the threshold. But you can think about it symbolically to say that he only likes her when she enters the space of movies, right? The space of looking as opposed to participating in, the space of what exists out across from his own window. When she becomes a film, she gets interesting. Right? That's a way of saying that when she becomes an object to be looked at, a kind of valued, overvalued, beautiful star, he becomes sexually interested in her. That fulfills this idea of fetishistic scopophilia. Now consider Vertigo, different in this respect. Scotty's voyeurism is blatant. So how is it voyeuristic? He falls in love with a woman he follows and spies on without speaking to. So clearly voyeurism is established. Voyeurism is like the act of looking at someone without them looking at you back. That's exactly how the film begins. And also, once Scotty actually confronts Madeline, Scotty's erotic drive is to break her down and force her to tell by persistent cross-questioning. So there's this moment that he is punishing Madeline by trying to convince her that her own seemingly supernatural explanation for her behavior is not supernatural at all. And the way he treats her is to kind of try to force that conversion of belief upon her. And then at the end of the film, where the punishment gets the most powerful, in the second part of the film, he reenacts his obsessive involvement with the image he loved to watch secretly. He reconstructs Judy as Madeline, forces her to conform in every detail to the actual physical appearance of his fetish. Her exhibitionism, her masochism, makes her an ideal passive counterpart to Scotty's active sadistic voyeurism. Once again, we have this idea that the narratives that were designed in these two films somewhat perfectly exemplify the points about power and gender that Laura Mulvey is trying to establish. She exhibits herself as part of the narrative, right? And she kind of is a masochist in terms of accepting and almost desiring the punishment that he doles out on her, right? One question to ask is, why does she let him treat her this way? Because it's rather abusive. Mulvey is calling that masochistic behavior, a way to kind of allow her to compromise her own sense of autonomy for the love that she has for Jimmy Stewart's character. There is a sadistic voyeurism, right? He is punishing her. And we get a literal kind of physical punishment at the end of the film when he forces her up the tower, and then she falls to her death, punished by death by the narrative design of the film, right? He doesn't kill her, but the film does through this almost deus ex machina figure of the nun. So those are the ways that like Mulvey's male gaze works in terms of form and narrative design. Now, what's the point of her essay? Everyone forgets that there's this part of her essay where she's not just doing the work of diagnosing a problem, she actually wants to put forth a call to action to not solve the problem, but at least do some kind of work to thwart or suppress this problem. And it's about actually making avant-garde movies, right? So we watched an avant-garde movie that I think Laura Mulvey would like, and it was called La Chambre by feminist filmmaker Chantal Akerman. It's an avant-garde film, and what I mean by avant-garde film is I mean more or less what I mean by experimental film. It's not a conventional narrative, it's short, it doesn't exhibit any of the qualities that we would attribute to a classical Hollywood narration. Think about what's going on in it. Mulvey might say about this film, we have a woman who seems to exhibit to be looked at-ness, right? She is on a bed reclining, a conventional, hyper-conventional way of depicting women in Western painting. Think about how many women recline in like the depiction of nudes, for instance. She looks, but Mulvey might say it's important that she looks right back at us. There is a kind of confrontational look that Chantal Akerman, who plays this woman in her own film, performs by looking at the camera. She defeats the cameras and our voyeurism, right? Because voyeurism is about looking at people without them looking back at us. And we can say one thing about this film is that Chantal Akerman is looking right back at us, right? There's also no narrative structure, right? Mulvey thinks the male gaze requires a narrative. When you don't have one, you free yourself from those confines. Also, the camera moves without respect to an agent who looks. There's something very strangely robotic about the camera. It doesn't seem to embody what a person might do, right? It's not as if this is a film with two subjects, a person who is looking, that is the camera, and a woman who looks back. It's almost like we have a robotic camera that just rotates and makes decisions regardless of any sense of desire, right? When the camera goes back and forth and changes its mind, it's like, is that a masculine presence or not? It's really hard to say. So this film seems to defeat a lot of the qualities that we attribute to the male gaze, and it's an avant-garde film. Now, I want to end this recap of Mulvey by considering a number of responses that we might make to Mulvey's article.